Vietnam, a nation that has never ceased fighting against invasion throughout its history. There were victories and there were defeats. But on rare occasions, defeat came at the cost of an entire civilization. This is a 36-minute documentary about the moment Vietnam was conquered in 1407, told from the perspective of those who lived through it. If you are ready, let us begin.
Benevolence lies in bringing peace to the people. A righteous army first seeks to eliminate tyranny.
Nguyễn Trãi reflected on these words for a long time, yet he still could not write what came next.
When I first entered official service, our country was undergoing a great upheaval. The once powerful Tran dynasty had weakened, and a single family seized power to establish a new dynasty. This became a golden opportunity for the Ming court in the north to invade. And for the first time, that threat felt truly real. The prince of the new dynasty once spoke a line I deeply agreed with. He said, "I do not fear war. I fear only that the people will not stand with us." The retired emperor understood this as well, but he chose to trust in his own calculations. When the Ming first sent troops into our land, we resisted fiercely, refusing to allow them to impose a counterfeit puppet king upon our country. In the initial clashes, we appeared to hold the advantage in numbers and defensive position. Even so, the fighting was brutal, casualties were severe, and we came dangerously close to a catastrophic defeat. The true turning point came only when we deployed a separate force to launch a sudden ambush, cutting off the enemy's retreat. When a narrow mountain pass is sealed, the opposing side can never know how many troops await them. The enemy surrendered and handed over the pretender king, and we were compelled to execute him by lynching in order to preserve the legitimacy of the dynasty. But that act also meant provoking the Ming court. Once the bridge was burned, reconciliation became nearly impossible. From the Ming perspective, a small state openly claiming equal standing and brutally executing a ruler appointed by the empire was an unmistakable act of defiance. Zhu Di himself was an emperor who had seized power through force, and there were more than enough reasons for the Ming to go all in. First, to uphold the authority of the central court, both domestically and abroad. Second, Jiaoji was rich in resources, abundant in talent, and occupied a strategically vital position. Clearly, the Ming were anything but careless in preparing their invasion. They dispatched veteran generals who had once helped Ming Chengzu seize the throne. They remembered the Yuan dynasty's failure, and this time they prepared their logistics in advance. An enormous force of more than 200,000 troops was exaggerated in propaganda. Zhu Di was a strategic genius. Half his life had been spent personally defeating the Mongols time and again. Against our land, he committed heavy infantry in full force, fully prepared for a war of attrition. And the Ming cavalry, the same cavalry that had once fought the Yuan heavy horsemen, now stood against us. The Mongols' former advantage in mobile cavalry was now possessed by the Ming. When an enemy offers very few weaknesses to exploit, we must instead focus on our own strengths. Could our army compare to the forces of the old Tran dynasty? I cannot say. But one thing was certain. The standing army of this era was larger than before. Imperial policies had mobilized vast resources, expanding troop numbers and equipment. We also possessed dozens of war elephants, weapons that had long proven effective against enemies from the north. Scorched earth tactics were once again employed, though this time they could not be carried out fully, for the people did not truly cooperate. And so, we were left with only one choice: direct confrontation. We constructed a defensive line stretching over 400 kilometers. Hard against hard. And personally, I was not confident of victory. we were no longer fully embodying the essence of Tran Hungdao's military philosophy, meant a war of attrition against the Ming, contest we could not afford. The difference this time was clear. The enemy possessed firearms. 1 in every 10 Ming soldiers carried them, whether on open ground or behind fortifications. This was a decisive strategic advantage. Before firearms, even war elephants failed to perform as expected. What remained was human courage alone. Battles erupted along the rivers. The divine cannons of Đại Ngu became our secret weapon, momentarily shocking the enemy. But the Ming, too, possessed their own dense networks of firepower. And as expected, the war descended into a brutal stalemate.
Let me ask you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you're a farmer living under the Ho dynasty. The dynasty that your village and your family for generations had respected is suddenly gone. A new regime takes over, and almost immediately, your life is turned upside down. New laws appear everywhere. They're strict, they're inconvenient, and honestly, you don't see any clear promise of a better future. Your neighbors are unhappy. Many local elites are unhappy too. Now, war is coming. Usually, when we talk about invaders, we imagine cruelty and destruction. But this time, it doesn't look that way. Even the village officials, the people you deal with every day, are openly cooperating with the Ming army. And the Ming soldiers themselves don't act like monsters. They keep saying, "We're here to help. Life will be better under us." At the exact same time, the dynasty you already don't trust gives you an order. Burn your crops, destroy your food, abandon your home, run into the forests or the mountains. And they add a threat. Anyone who helps the Ming will be punished later. Think about that for a second. Everything your family has saved up since your grandparents' time, gone. And in return, an uncertain future. No guarantees. So let me ask you a simple question. Who would you believe? And here's something very important to remember. This is a world before modern nationalism. People didn't think in terms of abstract loyalty to a nation state. Most people sided with whoever could give them a better, safer life. Right now. Now let's zoom out and look at the strategy itself. Scorched Earth is a brutal strategy. You hurt yourself first, hoping the enemy suffers more. And it only works under one condition. Everyone has to follow it. People must truly disappear into forests and mountains, cutting off every possible supply line. But what if that doesn't happen? What if out of 10 people, just 2 decide to cooperate with the enemy? At that point, the strategy collapses. It no longer pressures the invading army. It only buys a little time, nothing more. And that, exactly, was the situation the Ho dynasty faced. They played the same card that had worked before in history. But this time, the conditions were different. And because of that, the card was completely neutralized.
But at this moment, tragedy struck. Human beings are the most unpredictable variable of all. The general entrusted with guarding the anchorage of our naval fleet became lost in indulgence and neglected the defenses. The Ming seized the opportunity and launched a sudden assault. The true power of mobility lies in the ability to choose the time and place of battle. Years of fighting and defeating the Mongols had forged the Ming army into a force of sharp tactical awareness and swift maneuver. The Vietnamese defensive force was caught completely off guard, and the fleet meant for reinforcement and river operations was burned to ashes. Our army lost its mobility advantage on the rivers. The 400-kilometer defensive line was breached, and the next objective was Da Bang Fortress. The system of ramparts slowed the enemy's advance, but only bought time. If Da Bang were to fall, the entire campaign would collapse. Hope was placed in the divine cannons we had invented. Ming casualties accumulated gradually. From the high walls, our firearms held the advantage in accuracy and elevation. The inventions of Prince Trung began to show their effect. This was part of the plan, to use technological superiority for defensive warfare, but it was arrogance, and in part, naivety. The Ming commanders resolved to take the fortress at all costs, regardless of casualties. The mighty fortress, and a defensive plan prepared over many years, now stood isolated and powerless against waves of enemy troops surging forward like a flood. The attackers pressed all the way to the walls, indifferent to their losses, to neutralize the advantage of our artillery on the ramparts. War is cruel in this way. The higher the casualties of the attacking force, the more horrific the revenge once the city falls. And when the fighting dragged into the night, catastrophe followed. Our side released war elephants to charge the Ming ranks, a desperate attempt to turn the tide. A bold move, high risk, high return. This time we placed the bet on the wrong side. When the war elephants of Đại Ngu met Ming firearms, the terrified beasts turned back into the city, throwing the defending forces into chaos. And thus, the moment of Da Bang's end arrived. Most of the army retreated toward Thanh Hoa, leaving behind only a small force to fight to the death. The mighty fortress, once the pride of our dynasty, fell in a single day. Yet the warriors of Đại Ngu themselves became the final fortress, standing until the very last moment. They fought knowing they were walking into death. They sacrificed themselves so that those who came after might live and wait for the day of vengeance. And the massacre began. In my view, the brave are not those who feel no fear. Perhaps they used fear itself as fuel, testing their limits to give rise to something greater than themselves. Perhaps they also knew well the fate that awaited prisoners in enemy hands. When Da Bang fell, Dong Du fell with it. What followed was nothing but brutal slaughter. The Battle of Ham Tu Pass was the last significant opportunity for revival, a rare and deeply ironic moment in history. Our forces were ambushed by the invaders on our own land, while our intelligence network proved completely powerless against that of the enemy. These warriors fought alone because their dynasty fought alone, yet even so, they wished to depart this world with honor. I want to know what they thought in the final moments of their lives. My heart tightens when I think of the names that will be forgotten. The Ming policy was clear: surrender immediately, or be slaughtered. There was only one choice left: to take their own lives. Those who had not yet taken their own lives were met by Ming units tasked with executing the wounded and survivors.
To understand this, we need to look at three core problems, and each one quietly pushed the Ho dynasty closer to collapse. Let's start with the army itself. First, the Ho army went directly against the military philosophy laid down by Tran Hung Dao. His principle was simple but powerful: use the short to counter the long value elite troops over sheer numbers, quality over quantity. The Ho dynasty did the opposite. They built a large army. The soldiers were well equipped. On paper, it looked impressive. But most of these troops lacked real combat experience, and more importantly, their commanders struggled. They were weak at adapting on the battlefield. poor at solving unexpected problems, and ineffective at coordinating units. So, what happened in practice? Strategic orders from the top were rarely carried out consistently. Execution broke down, coordination failed, small mistakes multiplied into major disasters, something we can clearly see in battles like Da Bang and Ham Tu Pass. Now let's move to the second issue, strategy. Ho Quai Lai abandoned Vietnam's traditional style of flexible warfare. Instead, he leaned heavily toward fortress-based defensive warfare. The problem is that this approach is predictable. It leaves very little room for creative, unexpected moves. And worse than that, it meant fighting the Ming on their terms. Ho Quai Lai's reforms had real potential. Given time and stability, Đại Ngu might have grown into a strong regional power, but it was never meant to be a state that could survive a direct, attritional war against the Ming Empire. Trying to do so was strategically dangerous from the start. And finally, the third and perhaps most devastating factor, intelligence. This was a complete intelligence failure. Many Ho commanders defected. That alone shattered any chance of maintaining operational secrecy. Compare this to the Tran dynasty during the Nguyen Mongol resistance, where intelligence was one of their greatest strengths. The Tran court consistently stayed ahead of the enemy, always knowing more, always reacting faster. The Ho dynasty had the opposite experience, partly because of betrayal, and partly because they lacked a strong intelligence and counterintelligence network. The Ho forces were repeatedly ambushed on their own territory. So when you put all of this together, an army that looked strong but lacked experience, a rigid strategy that played to the enemy's strengths, and a total breakdown in intelligence, the outcome becomes almost inevitable. The Ho dynasty didn't just lose battles, they lost control of the war itself. The fall of the Ho dynasty didn't happen overnight. It was the result of a chain of mistakes, each one building on the last. It unfolded step by step, over time. Let's walk through those mistakes in the order they happened. First, we need to talk about strategy. From the very beginning, the Ho dynasty made a critical strategic choice. They did not use guerrilla warfare or skirmish-style fighting, which had always been Dai Viet's greatest strength. This was the kind of warfare Dai Viet understood best. Flexible, elusive, and designed to wear down a stronger enemy. Instead, the Ho court chose fortress-based defensive warfare. And that matters, because this style of warfare was not only predictable, it was also the traditional strength of China itself. In other words, the Ho dynasty chose to fight the enemy using the enemy's preferred method of war. That decision set the tone for everything that followed. Now we move to tactics and battlefield execution. The first warning sign was the surprise attack at Mok Hoan Beach. This was a clear case of carelessness. The Ho forces were caught off guard, something that should never happen to an army fighting on its own territory. Then came the Battle of Da Bang. Here, the Ho army made a serious tactical error by sending war elephants into a direct frontal assault. Elephants function primarily as psychological shock weapons, effective only when the enemy panics. But the Ming army was disciplined, well prepared, and had prior combat experience against elephant forces in Yunnan. They knew how to hold formation and use missile fire and gunpowder to frighten the animals. Once the elephants panicked, they turned from an offensive weapon into a liability. Instead of breaking the Ming lines, they disrupted command and control, confused supporting infantry, and spread chaos backward through the Ho army itself. And then we arrived at Ham Tu Pass, where multiple failures happened at once. First, intelligence completely failed. The enemy knew the Ho army's marching routes in advance. Second, discipline within the Đại Ngu army was poor. Troops moved carelessly, without proper caution during the march. When the ambush came, the soldiers fell into chaos, morale collapsed quickly, and the fighting spirit was weak. And perhaps most damaging of all, the commanders hesitated. When they saw Allied units being ambushed, they froze. Instead of reacting decisively and rushing in to support, they became confused and passive. At that moment, the battle was already lost. Now, let's talk about a deeper question. Why was the quality of the Ho army so low to begin with? Some of the reasons were structural, even unavoidable. Ho Quai Lai's true strength was not battlefield command. His real talent lay in logistics, large-scale state reform, and economic and scientific restructuring. Even when he served under the Tran dynasty, whenever he personally led troops into battle, the results were consistently poor. Ho Nguyen Truong, on the other hand, was a brilliant inventor and engineer, arguably one of the finest scientific minds of his time. Together, their strengths were powerful enough to transform the nation's long-term military potential. But military thinking and battlefield strategy were not the core strengths of the Ho family. As a result, the Ho dynasty never inherited a strong military foundation. There was also a political reality. The Ho dynasty had just seized the throne from the Tran. Trust was fragile. Because of this, the court prioritized loyalty above talent. Family members and close allies were placed in key military positions. More capable generals had already been executed earlier, or they were simply not trusted enough to be given real authority. So, when we connect these 2 points together, a larger picture emerges. The Ho dynasty likely understood its own weaknesses, and instead of trying to fix everything at once, it focused on its existing strengths first: administration, logistics, and reform. Correcting military weaknesses would have taken far longer, and under the pressure of an approaching Ming invasion, there simply wasn't enough time. By the time the war truly began, the outcome had already been shaped. To really understand why Đại Ngu fell so quickly, we also need to look at the opponent it was facing. In 1406 to 1407, the Ming army was at the absolute peak of its military power. This was the high point of Chinese military strength before the later transition toward the Ming-Qing period. At that moment, the Ming possessed the largest army in the region. It was also one of the most strictly disciplined forces China had ever fielded. Their firepower was especially advanced for the time. On average, 1 out of every 10 Ming soldiers carried a firearm, something that most armies in Southeast Asia simply could not match. Their logistics were equally impressive. The Ming army was capable of maintaining food supplies sufficient to sustain its forces for at least 6 months, without relying heavily on local resources. That level of logistical depth gave them enormous strategic flexibility. Now, there is a very interesting pattern worth noticing. In both successful Ming invasions of Vietnam, the Chinese emperor at the time had just emerged victorious from a civil war. During the Han period, Wu Di defeated internal rivals before facing the Lam Uprising. During the Ming period, had only recently secured the throne after defeating his opponents in a brutal internal conflict. And the generals sent south were not ordinary commanders. They were veterans of those unification wars, were both battle-hardened generals who had helped unify China itself. In other words, the armies that conquered Vietnam in these moments were not secondary expeditionary forces. They were the strongest armies their respective Chinese dynasties could possibly deploy at that time. That context matters, because Đại Ngu was not facing a declining empire. It was facing China at its most dangerous moment.
And what of the fate of a king who had lost his country? I heard that the family of the Supreme Emperor was taken to Yanqin, awaiting judgment. I wonder what he thought in those moments. Did he regret any fatal decision he had made? What would he have done differently? There are many accounts of his fate afterward. Exiled as a common soldier, executed, imprisoned for life. I cannot be certain, but his son, Prince Trung, was spared and granted office. It is said the Ming Emperor held him in high regard, largely because of his innovative and advanced artillery technologies. The intellect of the South combined with the industrial scale of the North, and I believe the Ming would only grow stronger from this union. As for me, I resolved to flee Dongdo. I had to wander across every corner of this land of Vietnam. I wanted to witness with my own eyes what my people were being forced to endure. And just as I had feared, it was all deception. The Ming did not come here to restore the old dynasty. They came to conquer our country, to erase our bloodline, to castrate the men, to violate the women, to erase who we were, to make us all Chinese. They spoke only the language of violence. Killing was the only language they understood, and they spoke it well. War reveals the most beastly instincts within human beings. Once a hand grows accustomed to slaughtering civilians, what difference is there between one life and 10,000? We were no longer treated as human beings. They burned books and every trace of the civilization we once possessed. They sought to spread the lie that we were savages, civilized only by their hand. Mothers who would never see their children again, children who would never have the chance to grow up. This was genocide. and it was a clear message to anyone who dared to resist. And those who did not resist, they were forced to send every talented mind of our land to China, carrying away knowledge accumulated over centuries. They stole the essence of our people, leaving behind only wandering shadows. Jiaoji slaves were driven into the mines, while eunuchs ruled this land, ensuring that annual tribute quotas were met. Years passed, and I never stopped wandering. I wandered in search of a way to create change. I was not meant to lead, but I would serve with absolute devotion. I wished to serve a hero who could save this nation. Choice followed choice. Though strength and weakness shift with time, heroes arise in every age. Among the aristocracy of the old dynasty, some had survived. Could this be the rebirth of the great Tran dynasty? The Ho dynasty lacked popular support and lacked military talent, but the Tran did not. It is regrettable that I could not walk the same path as them. For my relatives had been killed by their hand, yet deep in my heart, I wished for their success. They were the greatest hope to appear. But hope was fragile and vanished like the wind. When fighting an enemy many times stronger, every decision becomes a gamble. And in gambling, where there is a winning hand, there is also a losing one. When we are weaker, even 10 victories can be undone by a single defeat. Who has ever won without knowing loss? Who can keep standing after enduring defeat after defeat?
So why was Ming rule in Dai Viet so harsh at that time? To answer this, we need to think less about laws on paper and more about how the people in charge actually thought. A big part of the answer lies in the mindset of Zhu Di and Zhang Fu themselves. These were men who had taken power through war. For them, violence wasn't a last resort, it was something familiar. They believed that when force was necessary, it had to be decisive, even brutal. And this is important. Many of the harsh methods later used in Dai Viet had already been used inside China during Ming internal conflicts. This wasn't cruelty reserved only for foreigners. In their experience, brutality worked. It broke resistance. It sent a message. In modern terms, this was psychological warfare, and they had seen it succeed before. There's also a longer-term strategy to consider, what we might call hard first, soft later. The ultimate goal was always assimilation, weakening local identity and absorbing the region completely. And after centuries of experience, Chinese rulers knew just how difficult that was. One way to manage this was to be openly harsh under one emperor, then ease up under the next. The father takes on the reputation of cruelty. The son appears more benevolent. Over time, people begin to see the violence as the product of one ruler's personality, rather than the nature of the dynasty itself. And finally, there's the economic reality. The Ming state poured enormous resources into conquering Dai Ngu. That investment had to pay off quickly. Otherwise, it would become a heavy burden on the empire. The campaign itself was unusually expensive. The Ming had to move farther than usual, deploy larger armies, and keep troops stationed in the region for long periods. At the same time, Zheng He's voyages were draining vast amounts of timber and money from the state. Under that kind of financial pressure, gentle governance simply wasn't a priority. Dai Ngu had to be exploited fast, and in that context, harsh rule wasn't just cruelty for its own sake, it was a calculated decision. When you put all of this together, mindset, long-term control strategy, and economic pressure, the brutality of Ming rule in Dai Viet starts to make much more sense.
Benevolence lies in bringing peace to the people. A righteous army first seeks to eliminate tyranny. That became my life's purpose. At last, I heard of a man who seemed worthy. An extraordinary man. A man among the wealthiest of his time, with thousands of retainers. Yet he was willing to sacrifice his entire fortune to rise in rebellion. As I considered joining him, my cousin and I discussed the origins of Leloy. Came from a locally wealthy family. He came from the mountain cultures, and this was a disadvantage for the uprising to expand further. They were our people, yet we also called them outsiders. 18 men swore an oath of loyalty, determined to fight the Ming to the very end. But willpower alone was not enough, for the cultural divide between the mountain people and the lowlands had long been deep. Though of the same country, they had grown distant. Sooner or later, a banner would be needed to unite the entire people. For such a banner to convince the people, it had to carry both benevolence and authority. Benevolence comes from protecting the people, and authority comes from decisive victory. After 16 years of invasion, people had awakened from illusion. The leader they needed was one who truly wished to protect them, and such sincerity cannot be faked. Hardship and sacrifice are its proof. 3 times they faced the catastrophe of total annihilation. 3 times they withdrew into the mountains, struggling to survive day by day, forced to witness his own people oppressed. They were not born into poverty, yet they came to understand suffering more deeply than anyone else. They ate roots, chewed whatever the mountains could offer, just to stay alive. Every moment lived in constant vigilance between survival and death. These rebel leaders possessed something other nobles did not. They truly understood the people. With the support of the people, they could lose 10 battles and still not perish. Always returning, reborn, stronger, more resilient, wiser. They stood for the people, and for the people, they were willing to fall. And even those who fell did so without regret. For the fire they lit was carried on by those who lived, undying. When this mountain army descends into the lowlands, history will be changed, and I must become a part of that history. My entire youth was spent wandering. I heard of countless uprisings, but this one was different from all the rest. This one, they know how to fight and know how to survive. What could I offer them? My unique perspective. I had traveled the world, observed countless lives, and never stopped learning the nature of the human heart. I read the enemy's mind, identify the weakness within their thoughts, and learn how to manipulate them. If the Lam Sơn Uprising were to win through courage and military strength, then I would strike directly at the hearts of men.
And so, the meeting between Lê Loi and Nguyễn Trãi was destined. Yet years before that, on a mountain deep in the highlands, far from the prying eyes of Ming spies, destiny had already bound together 18 mountain leaders, men who chose to abandon lives of wealth and peace, to change the fate of the nation, and to protect a people who may not yet have even loved them. But they will one day.
Before we go any further, let's clarify who these 2 groups were, in very simple terms. Lowland communities lived mainly in river deltas and plains, and were closely connected to the central court. They paid regular taxes, followed state laws, and were tightly integrated into the administrative system. Highland, on the other hand, refers to upland and frontier communities, people living in hills, forests, and border regions. They were not fully centralized under the court. In practice, they operated like semi-independent groups, led by local chiefs who held real power on the ground. With that in mind, the rest of the picture becomes much clearer. The highlands were not simply local populations under firm royal control. In theory, they belonged to the same realm. In reality, the central court's authority over them was limited. The state could not govern them in the same direct way it governed the lowland. Because of this, the 2 groups developed very different attitudes toward each other. People in lowland areas often saw the highland as uncivilized or backward. Meanwhile, many highland communities viewed the lowland as tax collectors, agents of a state that demanded resources but offered little in return. They did not see each other as one person. Instead, they behaved like separate groups sharing the same territory under a single dynasty. When highland groups did join resistance against foreign invaders, it usually happened under very specific conditions. The ruler or commander had to personally convince highland leaders that their interests and long-term vision were aligned with the dynasty. This was exactly what Trần Hat Duat achieved. Now consider what this meant during Lê Loi's uprising against the Ming. Lê Loi came from a highland cultural region. From the perspective of many lowland communities, his rebellion was something to observe rather than immediately join. Even if he succeeded and established an autonomous territory, it could easily be seen as a victory for one highland group, not a movement to restore freedom for the lowland population of Dai Viet as a whole. That hesitation makes sense in this context, which is why Leloir's greatest challenge was not just defeating the Ming on the battlefield. It was convincing the lowland population that his cause was also their cause. And that kind of trust could not be built on promises alone. It required clear, visible proof. How that proof was eventually established. That's a story we'll explore in the next episode of our film series.